first of all, the first paragraph says that this guy Garcia was trying to show that the Mexican-American generation between the 1930s and 1960s was, quote, more radical and politically diverse, right? Okay, so that's Garcia's claim, and I got really confused when I was reading the next paragraph because I was like, wait a sec, this guy is saying, well anyways, we'll get into that, but the main point is clearly on line 10, right? His study, however, suffers from two flaws, and then we have the two flaws, okay? Now, in the reason I got confused was because the second paragraph is saying what about Garcia's analysis?
There's a flaw.
There's a flaw, and what is that flaw?
It's not consistent.
It's not what?
It's not entirely consistent.
It's not consistent. And what? Yeah, Kayla?
That he minimizes the differences between Mexican-American activist groups.
Yeah. Garcia basically says there's this consensus where there's really not this consensus, right? That's said several times, and it's the very last sentence as well. In other words, there's not as much political diversity, but yet the very first paragraph said that this guy is claiming that there is political diversity. So this guy is saying that this guy is thinking that Garcia thinks there's political diversity, but Garcia fails because actually Garcia argues that there is consensus when there is in fact political diversity. So I was like, that is an inconsistency, but aren't you arguing for the point that Garcia was trying to make? So it's kind of a weird counter-argument, right? It's kind of like, well, you messed up, but what you were trying to say is actually right. You just did a poor job of convincing us of that. Yeah.
Maybe I just misunderstood because I interpreted it to mean that there is diversity, but just not as, I mean, maybe it's just, I don't know if I'm repeating what you just said, but that there is diversity, but that there's like opposition within that diversity, not necessarily like the level of consensus. But I didn't take away that there's not diversity.
Well, I think what the author of the passage is arguing is that there is more diversity than Garcia.
Okay, yeah, including just like
Garcia effectively argues.
Okay.
But one of the things that's ironic is that at the very beginning of the passage, the author said that Garcia is arguing that there is more political diversity. Yeah.
I'm confused just because that's what you're saying is not at all what I thought it was.
Okay. Yeah. Well.
So I thought that the author. So when the author said that, was more radical and politically diverse, and then he goes into like this idea of consensus. I didn't think that necessarily were two oppositional ideas. Like what I took away from that was that there was political diversity, and that's like fine. But where the author is disagreeing is that like Garcia thought that like despite that political diversity there was consensus, and that consensus was like towards like these kinds of reforms and like what they wanted to accomplish with these reforms. Like there could still be political diversity within that consensus, and so the author was arguing though that like that because of the political diversity that consensus was undermined.
Yeah.
So
I agree. The consensus is. So Garcia thinks there's consensus, right?
Yeah.
And the author thinks, there's no consensus.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very clear on the last sentence, right, of that paragraph. I guess the only reason I was slightly confused is because the very first paragraph says that Garcia is arguing that these people were more radical and politically diverse than what other historians thought. Yet, the author is now saying that Garcia is arguing for consensus.
Are those two ideas, like, they can't?
Oh, no, not that they can't coexist. It just kind of felt like basically the author is saying that Garcia is arguing for political diversity, and then in a nutshell says, then Garcia argues for consensus, and the author says there isn't consensus, consensus because there's so much political diversity. Which is what Garcia was arguing initially. So I was kind of like, it's almost like the author is arguing for what Garcia was trying to argue for. You see what I'm saying?
Not really.
Which actually makes sense. No, well, so here, keep going. Hold on. Notice this. This is on line 15. Indeed, he undermines his primary thesis by emphasizing an underlying consensus. Like, he's arguing that there's diversity, and then he, like, changes course and starts arguing for consensus. And this author is like, no, there really is diversity.
Okay.
So ultimately, this author is, like, agreeing with Garcia's overall point
Okay.
that Garcia fails to prove by then mistakenly arguing for consensus.
Okay.
Yeah, which was like, I was like, wait, who is arguing for what? That's why I was like, had to like do a double take, right? Anyways, in the last paragraph, Garcia thinks that what? That more and more people were, or more and more Mexican Americans were being born in America, right? And that led to more political activism. And in a very wordy way, this author says, what?
That doesn't exist.
Wait,
They're
what?
not like connected. That doesn't
We-
necessarily.
Not necessarily good. They might be, but we need to do a lot more research to figure that out. Are we cool with that? All right. Any other questions, thoughts, comments on this passage? Okay.